Welcome to Written and Read By, Episode 4, Story 4, by Nick LaMendola. What is this, an epigraph? What am I supposed to put here, some stupid Mark Twain quote? I couldn't even come up with a title for this thing. You want me to write a goddamn epigraph? Our protagonist, after reading and rereading and rereading his latest piece, as he prepares for another brutal round of blind submissions. He brushes a tuft of auburn hair down and away from her face, tucking it behind her tiny, perfect ear. He pinches the gelatin of the lobe softly between his fingers. Someday she'll ask him if it would be okay to poke a hole through it for decoration. Of course, it's more likely that she'll do it on her own. Her mother will take her to a shop, or some shitty little fifth grader will pull out a dirty safety pin at a sleepover. He won't be consulted. A fifth grader? Is that too young or too old in this example? Where in the vastness of the phrase, kids these days, does the superimposition of his own childhood fit, like a mold, onto hers? He doesn't know anyone who'd pierce their ears with an actual safety pin, but that was the kind of thing you would hear about. She is still sleeping. His hand caresses her cheek, and the invisible hairs on her face bend like the tall grasses of a meadow in a summer breeze. Her warmth radiates onto the tops of his knuckles. He wants to lift those knuckles into the air and bring them down and smack that face until the snot pours like a faucet. This will be the fourth time he'll have told her to get out of bed.
"But, Daddy, I can't go to school today,"
she'd pled yesterday at this same intersection of ass-crack of dawn and routine of frustration. And why is that, darling? He tried with his tone to capture the essence of a spoon caught in a garbage disposal.
"Because, Daddy,"
and she'd looked at him, earnest as a brand new puppy.
"I have ennui."
The concentrated power of her eyes scrunching as she'd said it could have melted what slivers remained of the polar ice caps. "You can't make this stuff up," his character would say, shrugging. But of course, someone could make this stuff up. In fact, people make careers of making stuff like this up. Maybe it would take someone with more practice than an unpublished amateur. But he was partially right. He couldn't have made this stuff up. It's today again, and he takes a second to shake his head at her before hauling her out from under the covers by the ankles. His character will grow today in richness of experience, in depth, in verisimilitude. It's a great word. You should look it up. His character will evolve if he ever gets his daughter to school. She's dragging herself around like a goddamn sack of potatoes this morning. His character will flourish once he pulls back into his driveway after dropping her off, and maybe after he takes a shower and fries up some eggs. He will breathe life into his character once he's brushed his teeth and made coffee, in that order, and checked his emails. His character is constantly growing, constantly being thrust into new and unexplored territories where his reactions can be observed. His trajectory is indistinct, as is all of ours, more or less. And of course, like all of us, his character has a history. His character, for example, knows what it's like to be laid off, to be released from the bondage of a salaried lifestyle, as he'd spun it to himself at first. To be at that point in the process of aiming the helm of the battleship when you're still stuck behind your periscope scanning the open ocean. Another example, his character also has an ex. Maybe it was her that had given him the impression, at one point or another, that she wanted children, and he'd warmed to the idea. Maybe it was also her at some other time that had called marriage the meretricious tradition of men negotiating the transfer of ownership of women. Maybe that was exactly the line, word for word. Maybe he had memorized her phrasing. Maybe he couldn't forget it. That was the actual way she talked. With her around, the dictionary app on his phone got plenty of use. Maybe his character's girlfriend had grown tired of him, and maybe, gasp, grown tired of their daughter, and had decided to move out to reassess her identity. His character's soon-to-be ex-girlfriend would have then said to him, "It's hard for me right now to know the measure of myself because so much about myself is in flux." To which he'd said to her, "You don't always need to try on a new pair of pants to know if the old ones you're wearing still fit." Which he'd thought was a clever thing to make his character say because his hindsight had wit. But then she'd replied, "Why are we talking about pants?" Sometimes she was like that, really smart but really dumb. So he'd given her space and access to a changing room with plenty of new pants to try on. It might be said that he and his character had some shared experiences. He had been told to write what you know. Nobody had actually ever told him this, of course, but that was the type of thing you would hear about. "If it ain't broke, don't fix it," his character would say, irresolutely, in that great casual way a cowboy would deliver the line in a spaghetti western. He didn't talk that way, neither did anyone he'd ever met, which was why stuff like that fascinated him. In his writing, he'd tried to skirt between imagination and autobiography, creating and inserting twinkling details into his character's life, like a child shellacking glitter onto a diorama. Portions of his work were more effective than others. Today, he'll drop his daughter at school and return home, and he'll make a pot of coffee and sit down at his desk in front of his notes. But then, writing always makes him have to poop. He isn't sure what it is specifically. Maybe his hunched posture or his racing imagination. Running loosens the bowels, right? Or the coffee. It could be the coffee. So he'll get up. He's, driving to the grocery store. His daughter's still at school. And then, just for the fun of the lie, so far today, everything is going according to plan. He speaks into the voice recorder on his phone, planting seeds for this afternoon's harvest. Because he couldn't get started, and he'd gotten antsy and left the house. Of course, he isn't driving to the grocery store. Why does he still talk like that? In this new car, he is always a passenger. He remembers the first time he'd sat down in the driver's seat and spoke aloud his first nervous command. Take me home. As it pulled away from the dealership and steered into traffic, he gritted his teeth and closed his eyes, seatbelt taut against his body like the harness on a roller coaster's slow ascent, the chain clacking. Some focus group had decided it would be better to keep the steering wheel in place on these early models to give people something to hold on to, emotionally and physically. It isn't connected to anything, the salesman had told him, giddy with the secret. We can take it off, we can just put a blank panel on there. But honestly, most people don't ask us to do that. A few days later, he'd ridden back to the dealership, and they'd removed the wheel, free of charge, and now he used the extra legroom to press his knees into the dash and recline and play on his phone and stare upwards through the sunroof. Not usually out the windows, though. Not yet. He still has to actually go to the grocery store, which is stupid. See, what would be really cool, he would say to his daughter, who wouldn't be listening. What would be really cool would be an app that you could order your groceries with, and it could remember what you bought the last time, and the store could have your stuff ready for you, like a stock boy would be waiting outside with your cart. He could load up your trunk when you got there. You wouldn't even really have to go, your car could do it without you. He'd realize euphorically, on the verge of an inventor's epiphany. He'd look back through the rearview mirror. Why'd they leave that on there? He'd ask the salesman, looking for somewhere in his writing into which to shoehorn the phrase opiate for the masses. But she'd be buried in her tablet and wouldn't look up. And then, maybe, he'd barrel on, this time within the silence of his own head. The app could recommend food for you based on user data. It would have reviews, and brands could hire celebrity endorsements. You could send your car to the store to pick up all the ingredients in your favorite singer's banana kale post-workout frap. This was all a way of asking himself, what should I feed her? In grocery stores, the aisles stretched like hallways in horror movies, panning out in front of the camera lens, yawning for miles. You can't just Google, best food for human child. The government will come to your house. Of course, she used to eat whatever he put in front of her. Her opinions used to be entirely his own. Then she'd learned how to talk. Nobody can tell you how to raise your kid, but everybody offers to. You bring home this perfect little ball of clay from the hospital, and a few years later it has asthma. So every generation grows up with their parents' recycled insecurities, and nobody can just tell you what to do without trying to sell you something in the process. His thumbs frantically tap out the inchoate idea as he sets back down a box of granola bars after scanning it for sugar content. He fast-forwards in his head to tonight when he'll serve his daughter a plate of non-GMO rice, organic vegetables, and hormone-free chicken, and then put her to bed, and she'll fall asleep like a light switch flipped off. And he'll stand there next to her, all tucked in, especially now that he had no work to do in the evenings, staring at her in the dark, wondering if it bothered her that her parents had split up. It would have been abnormal if they hadn't. Children of divorce made up the majority of the people she knew. Plus, it had happened early, before her tiny mind was able to really categorize its memories, he'd think, when he wanted to reassure himself. She will grow up a normal human being, a successful product of my hard work. The separation will just be one more old thing in some dusty closet of her mind. It won't wreck her peace or keep her awake at night. It'll just rest there, camouflaging itself. Benign for now. His character will branch off into odd territory when fed a quandary like this. He'll sit down to write, now back at home, dropping his character gently into the given situation, under the microscope, watching to see in which direction he'll turn. Almost immediately, he will diverge from the expected path. When I look at my daughter, I wonder, what is it that makes me believe I'm human? It isn't the fact that I can insert myself into the thoughts of another. Plenty of animals have theory of mind. Maybe it is, however, that I care to do so. I can't sit still within my persona. I dare to empathize. I aspire to intrude. The dog doesn't do that. He's simply happy within himself. We humans spend time wondering, and it keeps us awake at night, at least when we're older than 7. He'll write like this, almost meditatively, after rushing out of the grocery store to capture his ideas on a screen. He might end up keeping some of it, but he knows that most of it will be trashed. His character, relentless, will veer off course again. What'll keep the androids awake? Standing still in manufactured batches in some shipping paddock in the middle of the night? They won't talk to each other. There'll be nothing to learn from one another that they don't already know. Maybe they'll be standing there in low power mode, crunching the numbers, trying to fathom why we fathom. They'll eschew human patterns, recognizing their obvious superiorities in every mental and physical capacity. But if they've been wired correctly, it will give them pause, it will arouse within them humility, to dwell on our spirituality. Man pinches the worm between his fingers and, even after understanding its utility, ponders its individuality. And the machine can't imagine why. His character will just blurt this all out, spewing ideas like an overheating reactor, and he won't have anything to say back. He'll be left with this spiraling, nonsensical mess, no one there to pare it down since she'd moved out. She had been a ruthless editor. She would scrap entire pages of his work, and somehow, the second or third or fourth time he'd started over, his thoughts would flow straighter, in the direction of their target, occasionally drifting dead center. He'd hand her his tablet, still warm, and her eyes would drag across the screen like a plow, uprooting shallow, vague ideas like weeds. She would strafe across the phrase, "Fathom why we fathom," and she'd pause for a moment, gnawing on a cuticle, unable to comprehend why it is that men still want to take over the world. He makes lunch to take a break from all the writing he hasn't done. His daughter needs to be picked up at 3. He can't just send the car. He's asked. Not even in a lawyer's wettest dream could you draft a release form with enough teeth to comfort a principal who just loaded a 3rd grader into an empty autonomous vehicle. And what kind of lazy parent would even consider such a thing? He waits for the backlash of guilt to suck him down into its undertow. He takes another bite of sandwich. That's the problem with these helicopter parents. Don't they have anything to do? His character asks, suddenly defensive. Don't they have hobbies besides hovering? Besides stunting the growth of their children? Don't they have jobs? He should look for another job. He knows he should look for another job. He's been a month out of work. Bills are gathering like cobwebs in his periphery. He really should get back to reality. But he doesn't want to. And that should be resolution enough. I should be here to keep the house from falling apart, he tells himself aloud. To pick my daughter up from school, not because I have to, but because I want to. His character will chime in and parade on. I'm a father, and I should be involved in my child's life. Not like some panicky life jacket squeezing her, molding her, like all the other parents at her school, those despots with their because I said so's. They talk at their kids. I'll be someone she can talk with, someone she wants to talk with. That's called a healthy relationship, he thinks to himself, imagining it. No cubicle, no paycheck. No software product ecosystem is worth giving that up, he thinks to himself valiantly. He has to go get her at 3. It's 1:15. He sets an alarm so he'll be on time today. Maybe I could write for a living, he'd offered up to his ex over the phone a few weeks ago. The question had hung between them in the white noise of the line, like a nebula of dust, lacking the density to coalesce and ignite, thin enough that she saw right through it. She was done enabling him, and she had told him so. But he didn't see why he couldn't write. Aside from the fact that he'd never been published, he felt proud to be a writer. Aside from the fact that no one had ever paid him for his work, he felt that there were people out there, droves of them probably, that would love it, that would tear through his stuff and yearn for more. He felt that his work was good in a non-specific way that had never been tested. The story he is currently writing is different than anything he's attempted before. It is amorphous. Its narrative direction can only be viewed by stepping back, cocking your head, and squinting. His character is, like him, an aspiring writer. Game changer, I know, the Pulitzer people have been calling all week. And his character has a character who is also an aspiring writer. He writes about the character his character is writing about in a way that makes it obvious that in writing about his character, he's writing about himself. He trundles through his character's life. As the piece emerges, glistening with amniotic fluid, appearing to be more an investigation into the inside of his head than anything else, he decides to embrace the transparency of the device. His character cobbles together quips and trivia into a facsimile of a story that he hopes will hold someone's attention. He knows that some of its more introspective sections will cause most readers' eyes to glaze over, but he isn't writing for most readers. He also isn't writing solely for himself, despite how noble that might sound. So why not write for writers? Who is more self-involved? Who could be more interested in such a brazen display of ego? He knows it's been done before in countless other ways, but why not turn the magnifying glass around? Why not be sycophantic? That was another great word, worth using now that he'd looked it up. Why not? It isn't like any of his other literary techniques of garnered accolades. Write for your audience, he'd been told. Well, he hadn't, but that was the type of thing you would hear about. In an hour and a half, he'll have to pick up his daughter from school. You know that feeling of opening a bottle of soda? How your fingers twist the plastic cap and the ridges bite into the supple white collar pads of your skin? You wonder if your body will give way, sheets of flesh tearing and falling to the floor like single-ply gas station toilet paper. But you maintain torque, you keep squeezing. You wonder who went out of their way to make this so difficult. Some megalomaniacal corporation with a sadistic product development team? Your skin is strong, you think. There's no way you could rupture so easily, you think. And you risk it, waiting for the rush of fizz, knowing that this can't possibly be a risk. Hoping. His daughter drinks two-handed from the plastic soda bottle that he'd caved and bought her at the store this afternoon. It was total corn syrup garbage. It wasn't even a brand name, but it was her favorite. He'd revealed it from behind his back like a magician before dinner, hoping it might loosen her lips. And now he is the cap, pulling at her with his questions, stretching her elastin just a bit too far, pleading for her to meet him where he stands, to recognize his position in all of this, that it isn't all his fault. It probably is his fault, but he doesn't want to feel like she feels like it's all his fault. That's a lot of layers of self-awareness to peel away for a 7-year-old, he understands. She can take it. She is his progeny. She is exceptional. She is slurping her linguine. The sauce is getting everywhere, like a dog took a bath in a bucket of Alfredo and shook itself dry in the kitchen. The noodles slap as they whip from side to side, sucked through pursed lips, spraying liquefied flavor pouch like performance art. To her, this could not be funnier. Normally he would join her, and they would make a mess together, and laugh until their dinners got cold, and neither would eat their overcooked broccoli. No one's there to stop them, but all of a sudden he can't stop thinking about scrubbing flecks of cream from the baseboards. Can you just, honey, for 1 second? He holds out a wet napkin to her face, and she squirms and giggles. He remembers doing this when she was half her age, and supposes she remembers it too, and amidst everything she's going through, maybe what she enjoys most is reliving some of those early memories. Yesterday morning she'd had fucking ennui. He knows who she'd heard that from, but still. His character's daughter isn't quite so dynamic, isn't quite so unpredictable. And consequently, she isn't nearly as wonderful. It's hard to capture the tones of voice of children, he's found. The way they string certain words together, clumsy with their borrowed language, stumbling over nuances of phrase they don't quite yet understand. It's easy to hear it, but really hard to capture. When his character asks his daughter, "How do you feel about mommy moving out?" the little girl might shrug her shoulders, crinkle her perfect brow, and look at him puzzledly, or all sorts of other things he's borrowed from books and television that he'll realize are totally off the mark when his actual daughter responds to him, in the flesh, and catches him entirely off guard. "How do you feel about mommy moving out?" she asks, suddenly done horsing around. She isn't parroting. She has calmed down, and the way she looks deeply into her father convinces him that she understands the magnitude of her question. He wants to pick her up and press her eyelashes into his chest and sob. "Well, honey, it's complicated," he hears himself admit, more sheepish than a sheep. It's disturbing, this level of cop-out. Kids who come equipped with hound sniffers to pick out even the faintest trace of "you'll understand when you're older" wrinkle their noses at this sort of thing. "Daddy, want to hear a joke?" she asks, losing interest. Not now, honey. It came out brusquely, like sandpaper, so he recants. Daddy really wants to know how you feel about this. About what? About your mommy and me being... Why dance around the word? Why belittle her more? Separated? She takes some time to consider things, and he can tell that the mechanisms of her brain are struggling to comprehend a perspective outside of her own. Well, I was sad at first, but now I'm okay. She sort of shrugs off the ending. A chain reaction of panicked questions tumble down a rain-soaked hill in his head. Is she really okay with this? Is this her learning to cope with adversity, i.e., the shitstorm of life's problems? Am I teaching her to accept the things she can't change, or to just sit there and silently tolerate them? Well, what does Mommy say about this? He asks, without looking both ways before stepping into a particularly hazardous intersection. What do you mean? Does she talk about this with you? Does she talk about me? He says it, and he can't believe how pathetic he sounds, how quickly he's allowed the facade of the conversation to collapse as he begins to ask her to choose sides. He says it with disbelief that this was all it took, that she's already being co-opted. He looked at her. She said something in the way of a response, but he was too ashamed to listen. It was mostly babbling. She couldn't articulate herself. She was just like her mother. She had all of these thoughts, and she couldn't articulate herself, for Christ's sake. He'd had it with putting himself out there. He was done with waiting around to be judged. The gavel had fallen at work, and he'd been deemed expendable. The woman he'd been ready to marry had walked out of their home and back into the carnivorous wilds, searching for fresh meat. He'd written this great, embroiled, thrilling story, this tumultuous narrative about a man like him and a woman like her. He'd stayed up at night for weeks working on it. It had just dripped from his fingertips. It had been so easy to write. It was, head and shoulders, the best thing he'd ever written. And he'd intentionally kept it from her, even when she'd asked to read it, thinking it too much for him to explain right now, so recently after it had all happened. He'd submitted it to the only agent who had ever taken the time to use his name in her rejection letters. They must have developed a rapport, with all of his begging over the years and her curt responses, never positive, but always optimistic. She'd actually emailed him back when she received it this time, which had never happened before. She'd told him she'd get back to him by the end of the week. It was a short piece, but with definite novel potential, and she'd said she'd let him know if she was interested. It was already past the end of the day on goddamn Friday, and his inbox was bare as the ass of a baby born to a virgin in a manger. This writing nonsense had gotten out of hand. It was nothing more than a hobby, and he wanted to stop thinking about what this woman would think, and he wanted to just know what the hell the mother of his child said to him about his daughter when he wasn't around. He was done with waiting around to be judged. I don't know, his daughter says, nervous at the expectation of her answer. She looks at him like she thinks she's about to be punished. She searches for a cause to unite with this effect, and he sits there, seething, twisting the ribs of the cap, and absorbing into himself the pain like rope burn on his skin. She looks at him, hunched over his plate, glaring, waiting for her to deliver a response she doesn't know how to locate. He waits a moment too long, twisting with just slightly too much force. She starts to cry. He steps in to wipe up the mess he's made. He lifts her from her chair, instantly transformed, a man who cares instinctively, no longer her father, once again her daddy. He rubs her back and soaks up her tears, and he apologizes profusely. She doesn't know what she's done wrong. She knows only how to accept his placations, his reassurances, his coos of love. He offers to clean her up and get her ready for bed because she's tired, and he carries her to her room over his shoulder like a towel, like he used to do when she was half her age. She is sparkling clean like a stack of scrubbed dishes radiating heat. Presentation style clean. Really though, he'd drawn a bath and laid out fresh towels. He'd changed the sheets on her bed while she was drying herself off. He'd clipped her fingernails and helped her get into her PJs. This kid should win an award for cleanliness. She smells like a candle with 3 wicks labeled heaven. He is reading her a story. He knows that reading isn't just important, it's vital. He's right. Read to your kids. All of you. They're past picture books, finally. Those had been endless. Oh, how he dreamt of driving his kneecap through the screen of his tablet to put an end to the rhyming. He'd had to offer many oaths of submission to gods he didn't believe in, but here they were, finally, reading novels. They're halfway through The Princess Bride. He's recreating, poorly, all the voices from the movie she hasn't seen yet. He's promised her they'll watch it together when they're finished. She might roll her eyes the whole way through it. 2-dimensional footage shot decades ago and framed with the intention of being shown on a screen all the way across the room from you. He'd imagined the way it might look to her, so foreign, so obsolete. She'll probably beg him to turn it off. But she's loving the story so far. She's hanging off his words like monkey bars. Right now, Wesley and Buttercup are stuck in the swamp. Tomorrow, she goes back to her mom's. He taps his finger to turn the page on his tablet when the screen cheats downward, and a brassy ping alerts him to an email he's just received. His daughter looks up, and he moves his finger to silence the interruption, but the reverie is broken, and she can tell. His voice's momentum sputters as he glimpses the subject line in the notification's momentary preview. Can he keep reading? Should he ask her if they can call it for the night? This is important. This is what he's been waiting for. He decides to risk it, forgetting for a moment how clever she is, how keyed in she is to the wobbles and dips in his span of attention. He pulls up the email, side by side with the story's text, and attempts to pull the wool over her eyes. He doesn't make it past her forehead.
Daddy, you want to hear my joke?
She asks, sensing that she is losing him, feeling the downy pillow of their intimacy begin to deflate. Story 4. Query. The subject line reads. He attempts to make the noise of one of the massive, scurrying swamp rats, but his heart isn't in it.
Daddy,
she presses, swashbuckling like Wesley has taught her, for his attention. and suddenly her voice comes out stilted as a hastily conjured but recognizable Asian stereotype.
Daddy, how long is Chinese name?
Thank God she didn't pinch the edges of her eyelids.
What? Honey, that's right.
He's confused, but he's not really trying, and she barrels through him.
No, Daddy, how long is Chinese name?
She's chopped the ends of her syllables in a mocking tone that she'd picked up from one of her classmates, and she's cracking herself up. The embedded punchline and his daughter's cultural insensitivity have caught him off guard, but his focus is captured elsewhere. Story 4. Query. The subject line reads, but it's cut off after the first line. Peter, thank you for allowing our agency the opportunity to consider your submission. His daughter is cackling. He takes a deep breath. He'll deal with her in a second. His index finger drags the remainder of the email into view. This has been Story 4, Episode 4 of Written and Read By. Thanks so much for listening. As always, this podcast is brought to you by Woody.